In the village of Umuaga, there lived a man named Okwu, who never shed a single tear, not when his mother died, not when his wife left him, and not even when he was beaten and left for dead by thieves. The villagers whispered about him, calling him cursed. A man who does not cry is a man without a soul, they said. But Okwu was not soulless. He was afraid. He feared that if he ever let a single tear fall, his sorrow would drown him completely. So he did something no man had ever done before. Instead of crying, Okwu captured his pain in a glass jar. Each time grief tightened his chest, he clenched his jaw and let his unshed tears form as mist in his palms. With quiet precision, he poured them into the jar, sealing it tightly with wax. Over time, the jar filled with shimmery silver liquid. His sorrow, his regrets, his loneliness, he hid it beneath the floor of his hut, far from prying eyes. No one knew what he had done, but at night, when the world was silent, he could hear the jar whispering. The jar was not silent, it hummed with the voices of his pain. A thousand unshed tears swelled inside, murmuring in hushed tones. Sometimes he heard his mother's voice calling his name. Other times he heard the final words of his wife before she walked away. On stormy nights, the jar trembled, as if trying to break free. But Okwu never touched it. He only stared at the floor where it lay buried, pressing his hands over his ears, trying to ignore the voices begging to be released. One fateful night, a storm unlike any before crashed over Umuaga. The wind howled like a wild beast, slamming against the huts. Trees bent and the sky roared like thunder. Okwu sat inside his hut, hands gripping the edges of his chair. Then, with a deafening crack, lightning struck his home, splitting the wooden floor. The jar shot up from beneath the boards, spinning wildly in the air. The wax seal melted instantly. Before Okwu could move, the jar shattered with a piercing shriek. The moment the glass shattered, a flood erupted from it. Not water, but tears. Silver glowing liquid gushed out, writing like living shadows. It surged forward, pouring out of the hut, racing down the hill towards the village. The air filled with sorrow, whispers turned into wails, grief that had been locked away for years now free to spread. Okwu stumbled back, gasping as the floor twisted around him, filling his ears with the screams of his own pain. He fell to his knees, hands trembling. His tears had come back to claim him. The silver flood slittered through the village, creeping under doors, coiling into homes. The first to touch it was Nneka, a woman who had lost her only son years ago. The moment the liquid wrapped around her ankles, she let out a scream. She saw him, not as a memory, but as if he were right in front of her, calling her name. More villagers awoke, their cries filling the night. Warriors, elders, even the strongest men collapsed as forgotten grief clawed its way into their souls. The village was drowning, not in water, but in sorrow. But there was one who did not run. Uzo, a boy of 12. He had seen the villagers weep, had felt their sadness ripple through the air like a thick fog. Yet he stood firm. He watched the silver flood twist and coil, trying to consume everything in its path. Then he turned his gaze up to the hill, where he saw Okwu standing frozen, watching his own creation destroy the village. Uzo clenched his fist. "This must stop," he whispered, and without hesitation he ran straight towards the source of the flood. The hill was steep, and the wind howled like a ghost. The silver flood rushed around Uzo, whispering his worst fears, his greatest sadness. He saw the face of his father, who had disappeared into the forest 1 year ago. He heard his mother's cries in the dark. The flood wanted him to break. But Uzo gritted his teeth and kept climbing higher and higher towards Okwu, towards the man who had brought this nightmare upon them. You must stop this, Uzo yelled, his voice barely reaching through the storm. Okwu stood like a statue, unable to move. His body wanted to weep, to let go, but he had spent his entire life holding it in. His chest felt tight, his throat burned. He saw Uzo standing before him, the boy's eyes filled with defiance. Cry, Okwu, Uzo shouted. You must cry, or we will all be in lost. Okwu clenched his fist, his nails digging into his palms. He could feel the weight of the flood inside him, pressing against his ribs, screaming to be let out, but he couldn't do it. He did not know how. Uzo saw Okwu's struggle, saw the pain in his eyes. There was only one thing left to do. He stepped forward and slapped Okwu across the face. The crack of the slap echoed through the storm. Okwu staggered, stunned, and then something inside him snapped. His lips trembled, his breath hitched, and then a single tear rolled down his cheek. The moment it fell, the silver flood froze. The swelling mass of sorrow trembled, then collapsed. The village fell silent. The silver liquid shivered, rippling like a dying flame. Then it began to vanish. It sank into the earth, rising as mist, disappearing into the night. The whispers faded, the cries turned to quiet echoes. The village, once drowning in sorrow, now lay still. The people of Umuaga wiped their eyes, their chests rising with deep shuddering breaths. Okwu dropped to his knees, his hands gripping the wet soil. The weight in his chest had lifted, but in its place was something new. Peace. Elder Okeke stepped forward, his voice soft but firm. Tears are not meant to be hidden, he said. They are meant to flow. Pain must not be trapped. It must be felt, shared and released. Okwu, you have learned this, and now so have we. Okwu lifted his head, his vision blurred. He had spent his life fearing tears, but now he saw their purpose. He looked at Uzo, the boy who had saved them all. With a shaky breath, he smiled. The air felt different. The heaviness that had wrapped around the village like a dark cloak had lifted. The people of Umuaga sat in stunned silence, their bodies still trembling from the flood of sorrow that had passed through them. Some held onto each other, others wiped their faces with shaking hands. But something had changed. They were lighter, freer. The village that had once feared grief had faced it head on, and then they had survived. The people turned to Okwu, waiting, watching, as if seeing him for the first time. Okwu was no longer the man who never cried. He was the man who had felt. He had locked his emotions away for so long that he had forgotten what it meant to be human. But now, as the silver flood disappeared into the earth, he knew. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling. Then more tears came, not in a furious storm, but in gentle drops. And this time he did not try to stop them. He let them fall. Uzo stood before Okwu, his small body trembling with exhaustion. He had climbed the hill, walked through sorrow, and faced the man who had feared himself. And he had won. He had saved his village. But he did not feel like a warrior. He felt like a boy who had simply done what had to be done. Okwu reached for him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. You are braver than any man I have ever known, he said. Uzo smiled, and for the first time he felt truly strong. The sun broke over the horizon, casting golden light over Umuaga. The village, once drenched in sorrow, now glowed with a strange kind of peace. People emerged from their homes, stepping onto the damp ground, where the flood had passed. The pain was still there. Grief did not disappear in an instant, but now it was shared. No one stood alone in their sadness. They embraced, whispered words of comfort, and for the first time, they did not fear their tears. Okwu walked through the village, his feet sinking slightly into the softened earth. Here and there, small puddles of silver remained, tiny traces of the sorrow that had once consumed him. He knelt beside one, touching the shimmering surface. It rippled under his fingertips, as if recognizing him. "You are a part of me," he whispered, "but you do not control me anymore." With that, the puddle evaporated, rising as mist into the sky. The flood was gone, and so was his fear. For years, the people of Umuaga had whispered about Okwu, calling him cursed, calling him strange. But now, as they looked at him, there was no fear in their eyes, only understanding. "You have carried more than any man should," Elder Okeke said, "but you do not have to carry it alone anymore." The villagers nodded, stepping forward one by one, a hand on his shoulder, a quiet word of kindness, and a small smile. Okwu had been alone for so long, but not anymore. Okwu returned to the ruins of his hut, where the broken glass of his jar still glistened in the dirt. It was strange to see it empty, shattered and useless. He picked up a shard, holding it to the morning light. This object had once held his entire soul, but now he no longer needed it. With a quiet breath, he let the glass slip from his fingers. The wind carried it away, scattering it like dust. His sorrow no longer belonged in a jar. It belonged to the world. The village of Umuaga did not return to what it was before. It became something new. People no longer hid their grief in silence. They spoke of their losses, they mourned together, and they healed together. The warriors told stories of their fears. The women sang songs of their heartbreaks. And when someone cried, no one turned away. Instead, they sat beside them, offering warmth, offering presence. Okwu had broken the flood, but he had also broken something else, the chains that bound their emotions. To mark the day of change, the villagers created a new tradition, the Festival of Feelings. On that day, they gathered in the village square, lighting lanterns for those they had lost. They danced, laughed, and when sorrow came, they cried without shame. Okwu stood amongst them, watching the lights rise to the sky. "This is what we should have always done," he whispered. Uzo, standing beside him, grinned. "We had to learn it first," he said, "and we learned it together." Years passed and Uzo grew taller, stronger. He was no longer a boy, he was a man. But the village still remembered the child who had saved them. They called him Uzo the Brave. He did not fight battles with swords or fists, but with his heart. He had taught them that pain was not a thing to be feared, but a thing to be faced. And as long as he lived, no one in Umuaga would ever suffer alone again. Okwu grew old. His hands became slower, his hair turned silver like the tears he once locked away. But he never went back to the man he was before. He lived among his people, told his stories, and when he needed to cry, he cried. No longer in secret, no longer in shame. His tears fell freely, like the rain that nourished the land, and he was at peace. One quiet evening, as Okwu sat beneath the old baobab tree, a breeze rustled through the branches. It touched his cheek, gentle, knowing. He closed his eyes and smiled. He had once believed tears would drown him, but in the end, they had saved him. "Thank you," he whispered to the wind, and the wind carried his words away into the stars. One morning, Okwu did not wake. He lay peacefully in his bed. A single tear dried on his cheek. The villagers found him, and they did not cry out in sorrow. They wept in gratitude. They buried him at the top of the hill where he had once stood alone. But this time he was not alone. His people surrounded him, whispering prayers, lighting candles, and letting their tears fall freely into the earth. And from the soil where he had laid to rest, a new tree began to grow. From the place where Okwu was buried, a tree began to grow. It was unlike any other in Umuaga. Its bark shimmered under the sun, as if made from silver. Its leaves rustled like whispers in the wind. People said it carried the sorrow of the village, the grief that had once been trapped in a jar but was now free, woven into the roots of the land. The elders called it the tree of tears, a symbol that no sadness should ever be buried again. Beneath its shade, villagers sat, remembering the man who had taught them to feel. Uzo stood beneath the great tree, staring at its branches as they swayed gently. He pressed his hand against the bark, feeling its warmth, its quiet power. I will not let the village forget, he whispered. He had once been a boy who ran into the flood, who forced Oku to face his past. Now he would be the one to protect the lesson. He would make sure that the people of Umuaga never again feared their own hearts. That was his promise. The wind carried secrets. It moved through the village, coiling around huts, lifting the edges of sleeping mats. At night, some villagers claimed they could still hear Oku's voice in the wind. Do not be afraid to weep, for tears do not make you weak, they make you human. Whether it was their imagination or something more, no one could say. But whenever grief touched their hearts, they could close their eyes, listen to the wind, and know they were not alone. One evening, a small child sat beside Uzo under the great tree. She looked up at him with wide and curious eyes. Why do people cry? She asked. Uzo thought for a moment before answering. Because tears wash away the weight we cannot carry, he said. They make space for new things, new love, new joy, and new life. The child frowned. So crying is a good thing? Uzo smiled, ruffling her hair. It is the bravest thing you can do. The girl thought for a moment, then nodded. She would remember that. Years passed and Umuaga was no longer the same village it once was. It was known as the village that did not fear tears. People came from far away to see the tree of tears, to hear the story of the man who had kept his sorrow locked away. Some came with their own burdens, seeking to understand their grief. Others came to learn, to carry the lesson back to their own lands. And through it all, Uzo stood at the center, the guardian of a truth that had once almost drowned them. One day, a warrior from another village arrived. He was strong, fearless, his body covered in scars from many battles, but his eyes were hard, locked away from emotions. He had heard of Umuaga's strange ways and had come to test them. Crying is for the weak, he said. A warrior must never show pain. Uzo met his gaze without flinching. A true warrior does not fear anything, not even his own heart. The warrior scoffed, but there was something in Uzo's eyes that unsettled him, something he had never faced before. The warrior wanted proof. He stood before the tree of tears, arms crossed. If tears are so powerful, show me their strength. Uzo did not argue. Instead, he sat before the tree, closed his eyes, and let himself remember. He remembered Okwu. He remembered the flood. He remembered the pain of almost losing his village. And then a single tear slipped down his cheek. The earth trembled. The tree's leaves rustled. The warrior took a step back, his heart pounding. He had fought many battles, but never won like this. The warrior scoffed, but his hands curled into fists. Something inside him was shifting, breaking. He had spent his life fighting, never allowing himself to feel. But now, standing in this village, surrounded by people who did not fear their emotions, something inside him cracked. He clenched his jaw, shaking his head. But then a tear fell, just one. It landed on the earth, sinking deep into the roots of the great tree. The warrior exhaled, his body shuddering. He had lost many things, but for the first time, he let himself grieve. The villagers did not mock him. They did not call him weak. They simply watched, offering quiet understanding. A woman placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. A child smiled softly. And in that moment, the warrior understood. He had been taught that strength was silence, that warriors did not cry. But here in this village, he saw a different kind of strength. The strength to feel, the strength to let go. He looked at Uzo and nodded, his heart lighter than it had been in years. There were no more jars in Umuaga. No one locked away their pain. No one hid their grief in silence. When sorrow came, it was met with open arms, with warmth and understanding. And because of that, joy was brighter, laughter was louder, and life was fuller. The people of Umuaga did not fear sadness anymore. They knew that pain, like rain, would always pass, and in its wake, something new would always grow. Okwu's name was never forgotten. His story was told again and again, passed down through generations. He had been a man who feared his own tears, who had tried to contain his grief in a jar. But in the end, he had learned. He had to let go. And because of that, the village had been saved. His name was whispered through reverence, not because he had been perfect, but because he had changed. Every year, on the night of the great flood, the villagers lit lanterns and sent them into the sky. They floated upward like tiny stars carrying their prayers, their sorrows, and their love. It was a reminder, not just of what they had survived, but of what they had learned. Tears were not weakness, sorrow was not a shame, and no one should carry their pain alone. Uzo grew into an elder, his hair streaked with silver, his voice deep with wisdom. He no longer climbed hills or ran through storms, but he still told stories. He still sat beneath the tree of tears, speaking to the young ones, teaching them what Oku had taught him. A man is not strong because he does not cry. A man is strong because he knows when to let go. And the children listened, their eyes wide with wonder. One evening, as Elder Uzo sat alone beneath the tree, a soft wind touched his cheek. He closed his eyes, listening. Somewhere in that breeze, he thought he heard a voice, gentle and familiar. Thank you. A single tear slipped down his cheek, but it was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of peace. He smiled, letting the wind carry it away. And so Umuaga became the village where no one feared their emotions, where sorrow was met with love, where laughter rang loud, and where no child was ever told to hide their tears. The tree of tears stood tall, its roots deep, its leaves whispering in the wind, and in the hearts of the people. Oku's lesson lived on, not as a burden, not as a curse, but as a gift, the gift of being truly, fully human. Thank you so much for watching. If you got to this point, please give this video a thumbs up. It will help grow my small YouTube channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, do well to subscribe and turn on post notifications so you get notified when I post more content like this. Leave a comment in the comment section. Let me know your thoughts on this video. Share your thoughts on this story. If you haven't gone through my channel, do well to go through my channel. I have other interesting content as well. See you guys in my next video. Bye.